Hello, everybody. You just heard us. This is the three of us. We are from Indiana. I met a couple of people from New York today. How many people traveled further than New York today? Oh gosh, where'd you travel from? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be doing that. Rhode Island. Okay, that's okay. I shouldn't have did that. That was impromptu. So. Sorry about that. So thank you all for coming today. You had plenty of options, wonderful options on the roster today, and you chose us. We hope to not disappoint. Again, I am Timike or Mika. You can call me any of those names. I go by them all. I'm really excited to be here in person for NSAC. This is my first in person, my first since COVID, obviously, like everybody, only my second in-person COVID. My colleague Solomon, this is her first, and Cierra's been to 5, so we have all kind of levels of experience here for you. We're happy to be a team of preventionists at ICADV. Unlike we're able to have a team of preventionists, we're very lucky to have that at ICADV. Through rape prevention education resources and Delta AHEAD resources, we're able to talk with you all about prevention, but none of our ideas are necessarily those of our funders. We believe at ICADV to honor those who have continued to suffer under the multiple forms of oppression in the name of moving the nation forward by doing everyday hard work to dismantle those systems and end all forms of violence. We are dedicated to transforming communities we serve by redressing an equitable distribution of power, resources, and respect for those groups that have been traditionally marginalized. And we do primary prevention because we have the audacity to believe that violence does not have to exist. And so we're here to share with you today, like some of our strategies to do that and how we see our work. Solomon's gonna come up and speak next.
Thank you, Mika. So excited to see everybody today. You saw my full name is Stephanie Solomon, but I feel more in myself when folks call me Solomon. So that's what you'll hear folks say. But I wanted to get us started. And those of you, there's a couple of you who know this about me. I'm a fan of cats. All right, this is maybe not the slide that you expected, seeing a picture of pizza to get us started today. But we're going to do a case study. So you're going to learn a little bit about me. So just a little background about my life. I was in food justice before I entered this field. And I was, at least for a decade, a little bit longer, working at a community food resource center where I taught people about growing their own food and nutrition. Alongside, we had also a food pantry, but my role was really about education. With this assumption that if we had education about how to eat healthy, fresh foods, that was the choice that folks would make. However, I worked really long days. I was not paid very well. Many of you understand this situation, working in small grassroots nonprofits. And so in addition to that, I lived on a homestead with a partner at that time, where I was raising chickens and growing vegetables. But often those vegetables would rot in the fridge because my days were very, very long. And I was tired, all the other things. And so even though I had all the information, and I'm actually a rather exceptional gardener and cook. I'll just have an ego like that right now. But that does not mean that is that informs all the decisions that I'm making. So the public health community has all kinds of things to say about the way that we eat. I am not one to claim any food is good or bad. In fact, I would claim pizza is good. However, pizza as a fast food that I was choosing on almost daily, as a daily choice, while I had all these fresh fruits and vegetables surrounding me and knew how to prepare them, it came out of a specific place. So, yeah, so I wanted to take a minute to dig into why choose, and for you, like, do what you do in your brain. Like, I could have gotten even more honest about what some of my health behaviors are that I'm not super proud of. Maybe it's pizza for you. Maybe it's chili cheese fries. Whatever that is, I want to give you a minute to think about the prompts above. And we don't have a huge amount of time, but a little bit of time to talk to either your table, the person next to you, about some of what leads us when we have information to sometimes make health behavior choices that are not aligned with them. Okay, so it's 10:58. I'll give you a quick moment just to talk with the folks at your table. Okay, I felt a moment of the room going a little quieter. So even if you didn't share it with your group, is there anyone who's willing to respond with a strong thought or feeling that you had in regard to the prompts? Thank you.
So my response to the first question is, why do we eat pizza when we know better, essentially, is because we prioritize other things in our lives that take up time, and there isn't enough time left for me to use all the wonderful things I bought at the farmer's market on Sunday, because I've come home late and I have children and whatever. So it doesn't happen.
So time, thank you. Yeah, we have more hands jumping up.
So for me, it was more, I saw it from more of like a systemic lens, and the fact that pizza is accessible, it's cheap, it's, a lot of people, marginalized communities in particular, don't really have access to fruits and vegetables because it's more expensive to shop healthy. And yeah, so that's where my mind went.
Yeah, so I heard access, I heard how much it costs. We had a hand over there. Are you still interested? She answered it? Okay. Anyone else?
I'm going to give my colleague's answer, which is it's salty, it's fat, it's sweet, it's like the other reasons I respect, but I'm also like, I want it because it like is giving me that dopamine hit of all those, right? Like and you smell it, and that smell of that dough, you're just like,
yes.
Like that's why I want it more than I want fresh fruits and vegetables. Or I could add vegetables. I'm not gonna add fruit, but I add vegetables to it, and then it is like healthy adjacent.
Any other strong, if we have one more strong feeling, is there one? Oh, I see it.
Thank you. Welcome. Hi. I just wanted to add something that we talked about, in that we talked about pizza being communal, and how, when you're in college, you and a couple friends can put in a couple of dollars and you have enough food to last you for the week, whereas, those grapes are going to go bad in about 4 days. So.
I just danced this really awkward dance because I so wanted someone to bring up the communal part of it. Yeah, so it's, first of all, you save money when you eat together, but also like you eat what people like to come together and eat together. So you got this. So This is our way of thinking through it, and this came up in our conversation. So at the individual level, it tastes good. So we had it right over here, that salt, fat, acid, heat, sugar thing. I just said the name of a book. Okay. Also, I've never had a problem with it in the past. Like, that one didn't come up, but just like thinking about health trends. If it's not an issue already, why worry about it? It makes me feel good when I feel bad. I know a lot of the health behaviors in my life, that's what it's about, regardless of the long-term consequences that public health folks might be telling me about. Relationships. So like I'm getting together, I'm eating it with my friends. On here it says I always ate it on Friday with my family. For us, we might always have it at our youth council meetings. My friends and I like to order pizza and eat it together. Community, it's on the menu. That goes to that access that we were talking about early on. It's cheap, it's accessible, and then maybe healthy eating isn't a strong norm in my community. Again, not to say that pizza is unhealthy, like, you know, but just saying like pizza in excess in comparison. But that one, I think a lot of it is about this society level. There are lots of commercials for pizza. There's a lot of places to get pizza. And in the US, we don't have great regulation around the way that our food is produced. So you all got through a lot of that. Thank you for engaging on that level. So when we talk about trying to change public health behavior, and we say the words prevention, often what we end up talking about is awareness and risk reduction. So folks often argue that knowledge is the way that we can change public health issues. So we know that there isn't necessarily sufficient evidence to support or discredit that point of view, that knowledge alone changes behavior. However, we do know for sure through evidence that we can change community conditions in order to make the more desirable behavior easy without even educating folks about a problem. My example from my life that I was thinking about is there was this time period when I was in college where you could smoke in your dorms. And I mean, I was at IU Bloomington in Indiana. You could smoke in the bars, you could smoke in the dorms. And pretty quickly through ordinances, we went from living in a community where if you went out over the weekend, you smelled like smoke at the end, whether or not you were a smoker. But because of the environmental and structural changes, that was a rather fast one. And I think we've seen that in different communities, but it was really obvious in our community. So education and skill building are part of this, but again, not sufficient. And when it comes to risk reduction strategies, which we also call prevention, we're usually trying to minimize the impact of a problem. And so we may or may not be kept safe. Like, right, we all in this room know of risk reduction efforts that have helped to keep people safe. However, they don't fundamentally change the problem. And because they put the responsibility for anticipating or avoiding harm onto people most impacted, they're really not fair. They're not necessarily ethical. So really the assumption in our risk reduction strategies, and maybe it is a fair assumption in the moment, but not necessarily as we think about prevention, is that the injury and the consequences are inevitable. And so what we want to do is to think about how can we do the kind of prevention, primary prevention, that considers changes to laws, changes to structures, and changes to norms. So we'd like to invite you into this world with us. So we, not necessarily us, but the broader cultural us, often believe that awareness and risk reduction is sufficient because we believe that most problems are the result of individual failings, failure of knowledge, failure of morals, and failure of will. But if we consciously choose to consider that the approaches that we're using are not about the choices of individuals, but the context that we live in, then we can really start thinking about what are those structures that surround us that can impact our solutions. So I want to dig in and expand with Cierra.
Thank you, Solomon, for taking us through the public health example of pizza eating. So we can know all the things about health and wellness, but humans are complicated. So what we know is not actually a strong predictor of what we do. And Smedley and Smythe from the Institute of Medicine say it's unreasonable to expect that people will change their behavior easily when so many forces in the social, cultural, and physical environment conspire against such change. And this is why we address the root causes of violence perpetration. And what this means to us is we address the motivations to cause harm through impacting the contexts and conditions in which harmful behavior occurs. So we're concerned with creating the context that ensures the desired behavior is easy, available, and normatively and structurally supported. And connectedness, for example, is an excellent approach to sexual violence primary prevention because it is protective across the lifespan. And this image actually is an excellent demonstration of connectedness in action. This is a picture of a person enjoying the safety and connectedness of the sidewalks as they move through town. And you might ask yourself, sidewalks as sexual violence primary prevention? And I say, yes, indeed. Sidewalks might feel weird. It might feel disconnected from violence prevention, but remember, it's connectedness that we are approaching. It's our approach as we think about prevention strategy, because connectedness and social support, which are protective factors, prevents multiple forms of violence across the lifespan. Sidewalks also reduce isolation, which is a sexual violence risk factor. It reduces isolation structurally by enabling individuals to access critical community resource and their basic needs, like transportation and employment, healthcare, businesses, public spaces, but also fun and other people and parties and friends. Sidewalks are also a passive prevention intervention, and that means that it requires little effort and energy from preventionists after they are in place. And what's great about this is sidewalks don't only benefit people with different ways of being mobile through the community, they benefit everyone. So we want safe, stable, nurturing environments, we want safe, stable, nurturing environments to be the default, so safe, stable, nurturing relationships are supported. And culture change is complicated and it's overwhelming, and that's why I love the social ecological model. This is a public health tool affectionately called the SEM. And to me, these are my observations about the SEM. It does three great things for us as practitioners, and I'm going to go into detail. I am going to go into detail about each of these three things after I tell you what they are. So the first thing that I observe about the social ecological model is that environments and conditions shape relationships and individual experiences. Secondly, This allows us to make sure that our strategies and our approaches are in alignment. And third, it helps us map the impact of our work. And so in terms of environments and relationships, this model helps us identify the context for human behavior, so humans doing things, humans living, because what surrounds us shapes us. And therefore, we work to create the conditions that enable a person to choose nonviolence when they are faced with an opportunity to use power over another person. And the SEM really helps me see that and remember that. So this is an image of 5 nested circles that illustrate how the context wraps around individuals and their relationships in a giant public health hug. So norms and policies and built environments shape the communities and the resource distribution within those communities. Organizations and institutions that are part of the makeup of those communities shape the quality and quantity of our relationships that happen within those, from schools to businesses to organizations. And our relationships to ourselves and others are fostered by these contexts and conditions. And the SEM also helps us with strategy alignment and mapping our impact. So this is a really busy slide with an image of the SEM and the words that capture some of the impacts of that sidewalk project that I mentioned before. This uses the STOP SV strategy called Creating Protective Environments, and I'm actually going to return to this a little bit later. But I want to use it to talk to you about strategy alignment and our approaches to prevention. So to prevent perpetration, it's critical to ensure that what we are doing on the ground supports our purpose horizon or the end goal of where we want to end up. So sometimes we think we're doing the thing when we aren't. Sometimes we pick our vehicle for change before we pick the destination, and that's how we get off track with prevention. People don't harm in a vacuum, so our prevention needs to be ecological too. This means that our approaches at multiple levels support our prevention strategy. And that strategy reduces risk factors and increases protective factors. Is what I'm doing here going to get me there? The SEM can also help us determine where the impact is happening. So mapping our impact, the SEM helps us map where and what change is happening, not the activities that we are doing. By designing our prevention strategies from the goal backwards, what we want, we determine what it takes to reach that goal. And we protect our time and resources by understanding exactly what it takes to meet that goal. Who we work with and what we work on, and what we work on to change conditions and move power. And understanding impact is really important for sustainability of the strategy, but for those who are affected by violence, but also this impacts our working conditions. We've talked a lot about burnout and turnover, and that's why we advocate for environmental solutions. And all of this is really fabulous, but we still haven't talked about equity or the problem of power. Tamika, take it away.
All right, so I'm going to talk to you about our E4 framework. And some of you may have heard or seen about it before, but our esteemed colleague, Colleen Yackel, came up with this framework some years ago, and we've modified it and increased it and made it better. It is the framework that we use to create strategies. Because Cierra is talking about the SEM, and we're talking about prioritizing conditions and community and equity, but how do we actually do that? So we use, it's kind of like a clock in order, sort of. All 4 of those are necessary for us to approve a strategy. We call it violations. Like when we critique from this framework, we're like, that's an E3 violation. So equity first, efficiency, ethicalness, and effectiveness. Well, backwards. Effectiveness and efficiency. So I'm going to talk about those a little more in detail. So most of you have seen something like this. Consider this bicycle is our strategy to get a person from point A to point B. Our solution is at point B. The bicycle is a very fine bike, works really well for a standard body. It doesn't work for a really tall person, doesn't work for a little short person, doesn't work for a person who has mobility issues, and it probably doesn't work for a whole lot of other people. Maybe I'm out of shape, maybe a whole lot of things. So like that strategy is not going to be an equitable strategy. What we find happens in our strategy work is we create a strategy for prevention, we find it, we read it, we hear about best practices, and we kind of retrofit it for our populations. Oh, we're going to be serving this particular population, let's make it Spanish. That is not creating equity first. That is retrofitting a bicycle to making it fit whoever comes to it instead of making the strategy for the population most impacted. If the strategy were the bike that had the person who was in a wheelchair, everyone can get there, but we didn't ask those most impacted first what they needed. So we want to first be equitable. And we asked then, is it effective? So aspirin is a wonderful prevention tool for pain, not so much preventing pregnancy. So we want to see where are we getting our information and does it actually meet our needs? And who's telling us that it meets our needs? Is it the population of people we're serving that are saying, yes, this is what I need and it works? Or is it just saying, I talked to 75 people and they said that they learned something, so it worked? So like, how are we proving effectiveness? And what is our measure, our instrument in which we approve effectiveness? Being more conscious of only using evidence-based practices from our professors and universities and trusting communities to tell us what they need and how to make it work. Okay, I think I said it. And then we asked, is it ethical? What that means to us is very specific. Who has the burden of change? Who has the power and the resources to create the change, and where does the burden lie? If the burden lies on an individual to navigate hardships, adversities, inequitable conditions, oppression, then that's an E3 violation. It is not ethical for us to create this strategy because now we've put in the burden on people to create change. We often see that issue for us in like classroom education to young people. You're saying, you know, their problems exist, you should know where they are and know how to tell somebody that there's a problem. We find that without any other element as an E3 violation. Now, that doesn't mean that there is no personal accountability when it talks about violence prevention. We're just saying where's the burden and where are the resources and the people with the most able to contribute to the change. And then we ask, is it efficient? We know we are under-resourced in our work, and we also know that violence prevention, sexual violence prevention is not in a silo. Like all these other conditions impact what makes people vulnerable. And so we know that if we only look at efficiency as our work in our silo without looking at, does it affect multiple conditions? Are we using other organizations, other type of prevention efforts to create a system of change? Are we being a good steward of our resource in that way, of our time? It actually takes us just as much time to create a big to work 8 hours to create strategic structural change as it would be to talk to 10 people. So are we really being efficient with our time and our resource and our connections in order to create these big systems change? The pyramid just kind of shows like how many more people are impacted with those larger systems change and how we want to work that way instead of working down, up, opposite. Okay, so that is very quick E4 introduction, and we could spend really all day on it because it has so many layers of learning to it. I'm gonna give just a second to see if there's any questions about the E4 because I ran through it really, really quickly. Okay, in your, there is a E4 document embedded in the available documents in the app. I don't even know how to say that. So you can see it there, and it's also on our website. We can tell you more about it, but it is a great framework to use to create really impactful prevention strategies. So now we're gonna talk about power with Solomon.
All right. So I think I talked about that I didn't start in the field of violence prevention, but I consider the work that I've done to be for different forms of prevention and intervention on different social problems. And I'm amazed how long it took for me to really start building an analysis of the role of power. So those of us that are intervening or working on prevention of gender-based violence, we often think of ourselves as fairly powerless. We think of our CEOs and executive directors, our boards, as having a certain amount of power, but for lots of different reasons, we often feel like we don't hold power. But there are ways that we do. Those of you that do school-based prevention, when you're standing in front of a group of kids, that's a power dynamic. For those of you that move funding or have subrecipients through your coalition, that's a form of gatekeeping. And so a place that we want to start with in terms of why bring power into this conversation is that these power imbalances, as you'll see in the slide, and a lot of this comes from Human Impact Partner, it's about how structural oppression is created by power imbalances in those upstream root cause arenas. And that often it is at those sites of power that we have the most opportunity to make the broadest types of change. And so we're not just talking about, change at the individual level, but on a team, at our organizations, we can do incredible work moving power at the organizational level, and then continuing continuing through the social ecology. If the social ecological model, or the SEM, if that's where the power sits, when we're looking and we're saying, okay, where does power sit in the work that I do, we can map where there are places for power. And the way that we use E4 is to strategically keep us intentional about how we move power. I went further a little bit. I got excited about this connection because power analysis, it helps us see where we are, but it was difficult to think, how do we make the connection between power analysis, the social ecology, and the E4 framework? So just to say that one more time, because it helps me too. So if the social ecology is our where, and then the way that we're mapping power is using the E4, then we have opportunities to see where could the most and broadest impact be in the work that we're doing. So a couple of things there. We often try to talk about social problems and solutions without addressing power. Pulling back the veil on these power structures that impact our work, it helps us hone in on the most effective strategies that are at our fingertips in the work that we do. So we really want to make sure that we don't do any more of this work without talking about the gatekeeping, the decision-making, and the sites of power where we do our work. So in terms of definitions of power, we have a quote from Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Power is the ability to achieve a purpose. Whether or not it is good or bad depends on the purpose. I don't know about all of you, but I often think about power and immediately think of it as a negative. But there are a couple of different ways to think about power. So at this basic level, it's really about the ability to achieve a purpose. It's operating at all times, even when we're not aware of it. And if we aren't identifying power dynamics and working intentionally to power share, then we default to the systems that already exist, which are all too often hierarchical and oppressive. So when you think about the introduction, when we talked about maintenance of the status quo, if we are not extremely thoughtful in our strategies about addressing and naming power, we can end up unintentionally reinforcing the status quo, which is the system that promotes violence in our culture. So we have our constant power. It's operating at all times. We have our fluid power. This changes based on context. And then we have our neutral power. So we have talked about that power can be used for incredible harm, but it can also be used for incredible good. And what matters is really how we use it and towards what purpose. The types of power that we really want to be thinking about in the settings that we are doing our prevention work in are personal versus collective power. So I know a lot of these words are pretty self-explanatory, but often we focus on personal power when we're doing work that's about empowering others, helping them navigate systems better. And this is not a bad thing, but we would argue that it's insufficient as compared to collective power, which is organized, it's strategic, and it connects us to work that changes systems and conditions. My example that I love of that one was being part of an international group of people that were saying the charity model that we have around food insecurity isn't good enough. How do we address the oppression that leads to food insecurity in the first place and actually start to shift systems? And I see a lot of us doing this work here. Then we have visible, hidden, and invisible power when we're going through across the social ecology. We might be able to note where there's power at work that is actively trying to be hidden. There might be power at work that we don't see at all. But then the final one that I really want to sit with all of you with is power over and power with. So we live in a power over culture, and we see incredible possibilities to hold power together and to use power with in the prevention work that we do. So instead of going to young people and telling them what they need to do to stay safe, inviting young people and all different groups of people, I just happen to work with young people, inviting folks to be in power with and doing the work that it takes to move aside when you know that you're the one with the power, and offering that space to folks who traditionally aren't in power with you, but instead you are using power over. So how can we use E-forward primary prevention strategies that move power? Timike Jones. And good luck with that heel.
Okay, so that was a lot to digest. We've talked about environmental conditions, we talked about power, we have that E4 framework, we talked about insufficient strategies, and I'm gonna give you all a moment to talk with your table or your neighbors and talk about why aren't we doing that work? If you are, talk about what was the barriers, but why isn't this work the work that we usually do in sexual violence primary prevention? And why aren't we able, what are barriers to doing this higher level big work? And how it started and the process of how I really started to do this big work with not a lot of resources, not a ton of support, a lot of barriers, and really big work that started off small. So Cierra's gonna talk about her strategy.
Yes. So we've talked through the fundamentals of prevention practice and why a power analysis is critical. We want to share just one of our strategies to illustrate what prevention can look like when we change how power operates in our practices. So this is the cover of a document that I wrote that I'm going to go through and talk to you about. It's called Sidewalks to Sexual Violence Prevention, a guide to social inclusion with adults with cognitive and developmental disabilities. I invite you to eat it up. So the Stop SV strategy that shapes our work is creating protective environments, like I said before, and it is exactly what it sounds like, creating the conditions for thriving where the desired behavior is the easy behavior because it is structurally, socially, and normatively supported. The protective factor that we work to uplift and enhance is social support and connectedness via social inclusion. So the social inclusion is the approach. And the risk factor we want to reduce or eliminate is isolation. We want to eliminate isolation because people with disabilities are disproportionately impacted by sexual violence across the lifespan, and they lack access to interventions and restorative services. Activating Change, great organization, look them up. They did a needs assessment with people with disabilities all across the nation and found that only 13% of people with disabilities who are survivors get any kind of services at all. And to take this further into our practice, people with disabilities also lack access to sexual violence primary prevention programs and practices. A brand new article just came out called Review of Interventions Addressing Primary Prevention of Violence Against Women with Disabilities. And they did a meta-analysis and found only 12 programs in all the land of the United States that did prevention. And what they found is that all of them were very weak or moderate in terms of their effectiveness because of the high bias that they brought into the work. So additionally, all of them focused on skill building, not changing the conditions that enable violence to happen in the first place. And as a person with disabilities, with 2 children with disabilities, I actually, this feels very personal to me, and it reads like a form of isolation from services and prevention. And this singular approach is an E3 violation. The third E is it ethical? Does this strategy seek to reduce or eliminate risk factors in the community, or does it require vulnerable individuals to navigate those risks? And this is really where prevention practitioners are implicated in the problem of power. If our prevention is not designed to address the ecology of human life, like I said before, we might be participating in and actually reiterating the status quo. And said another way, skill and relationship building are necessary but insufficient to end sexual violence. Connecting this argument to the risk factor I seek to reduce, skill building doesn't address the circumstances of structural isolation or environmental disablement. And this is the reason why we start with E1. Is it equitable? Does the strategy uplift the leadership, needs, interests, and strengths of those most impacted by the problem? So I want to tell you a little bit about my project called Sidewalks to Sexual Violence Prevention. But before I get into those details, I really want to be transparent and point out the tension between my actions and how power operates in my decision making. So I need to tell you, I decided on the strategy. I chose the risk factor. I chose the protective factor. This was a coalition decision. I needed to be legible to funders before I went into the community, which is backwards. I talked about before starting with the goal and working backwards. So I did the reading and the research, but what I didn't know is what isolation and inclusion looked like for disabled people in the city of Bloomington, Indiana, where I did this project. And that brings me to E2. Is it effective? Has the community defined the problem so we know what types of solutions make sense? So this is another slide of the beautiful SEM. And on the left side is a list of our approaches at the individual and relationship level to get the results and changes at the organizational and community level. So each of the things that we did talked to each other and helped the effectiveness of each of the other strategies. I was hoping to demonstrate with this the ecological practices on this project, and here you can see how the approaches at multiple levels support the overall strategy of creating protective environments. So I have the enormous pleasure of working with 25 individuals with cognitive and developmental disabilities. Those central stakeholders told me what cross-sector partners we needed to work with. So we brought 8 cross-sector agencies on board, including the transportation department, which I really honestly had never even, it wasn't on my radar as like a prevention partner. And so I learned a lot. And what we did is the individuals with disabilities partnered with these cross-sector organizations for the entirety of the whole project. So they were in community with each other in teams to explore barriers to inclusion. And how we did that is we did evaluation the entire time. So really the process was the outcome. We did 4 forms of environmental evaluation and 4 forms of individual evaluation. And all of these helped us understand the Bloomington specifics of isolation and social inclusion for those most impacted by this social problem. So I'll tell you a little bit about these assessments. And by the way, all of these protocols for all of these evaluations are in that guide, and I would be so delighted if you would have it. So the environmental assessments that we did was participatory social mapping in businesses, public spaces, and neighborhoods. So we went on 3 excursions to 3 different sites within those like businesses, public spaces, and neighborhoods. And individuals with disabilities were the leaders on this, and they were supported by those cross-sector organizations to do this. And how we collected data during that process needed to be a little bit different because not all people used spoken English to communicate. Not all people what do I want to say? We used photo voice because it was an accessible and very impactful form of evaluation. And because not everybody could or wanted to use a camera, we also did creative writing and art sessions. And those allowed people to communicate through fun and art and creative writing their experiences of isolation and inclusion. The individual assessments that we did were pre and post tests with organizational partners who I really wanted to track their understanding of the public health approach to violence prevention. Like, do you understand the structural reasons why we need to map the community rather than just teaching people not to do sexual violence? We also, and by the way, the results were very good. We worked together for 3 years and everybody learned a lot together. We also did a circle of support, which is so I did the circle of support to measure individual network maps. So I did it 3 times over the life of the project, at the very beginning when I didn't know anybody, midway through to sort of track the movement, if there was movement, and at the very end. And you'll see in the guide that we started with like nothing in the circles of support, and by the end, people filled that entire thing up with all of the ways that they felt connected to the community. And with these forms of evaluation, I was actually thinking of our approaches, or what we do to get protective environments. So in evaluation, I'm looking to increase connectedness and social support across each point of interaction. So I'm talking about how individuals connect with each other. I'm talking about how they connect with organizations and how they connect with their community, but also how do the organizations connect? How are they connected? How are organizations in the community? And so at all of these points and nodes of connection, we tried to evaluate them. So we needed to map out the context as it was experienced by people with disabilities in Bloomington to create the prevention interventions that would work for that community. And that's E3. Is it efficient? Does the strategy have the potential to impact broad populations or multiple social problems? And so the social ecological theory for community mobilization also wants us to use active and passive prevention approaches. So the active ones are the ones that you're constantly doing, like doing skill building. It gets reiterated all the time. There's lots and lots of effort involved in these things. So what we did for active project activities at the individual level is we had leadership class throughout the entire life of the 3-year process, where the community members, the organizations came into the classroom with people with disabilities and just hung out and did stuff together. We did tons of relationship building. This was supposed to be a 1-year project. And actually, we could not get anything accomplished without creating that community together. I mean, people needed to learn how to understand each other because there were so many different ways of communicating, from ASL to communication boards to drawing and writing or pointing. And so we did a lot of cross-agency trainings there. And so that is also where I would use retrospective evaluation to find out where people thought they were before the cultural competency trainings, and then like how much they grew at the end. And we did a lot of systems advocacy together. A mobilization group formed for transportation, and they had an impact on policy and zoning at the city level, because we had the city of Bloomington as partners, as one of those cross-sector partners. So we did all of that so that we could have the environmental outcomes at the organizational and community levels. So one of the things that was really cool and surprising to me that came out of this was that people who were blind mapped the Monroe County Public Library and found all kinds of really unsafe things, like there was no texture transition in front of a stairway. And so if a person is blind, they use the texture on the ground. And there was also no way to navigate because the acoustics were so open, kind of like this room. Everything's echoing, and you can't locate yourself within the, like, it would be hard to navigate this room because over a 3-year period, they did an entire redesign of the stacks. And what this did is not only eliminate reports of sexual harassment, but it stopped drug overdoses. And so it wasn't just safety against sexual violence, it ended up impacting how people were using the space and being in the space and being comfortable in the space. And what time is it? Okay. So I have a little bit of time. So what we ended up doing is writing recommendations to the city of Bloomington. We did a lot of presentations to city zoning people so that they would take into account the bus routes that weren't actually, the bus routes in Bloomington, it's a college town. And so the bus routes and the housing are all designed around the students and when they come and go. It's on their calendar year, not a townie's calendar year, and that the bus routes serve the school. So they end at 6 p.m. Like, people who need to go to work cannot get to work. And so the transportation department decided to change bus routes as a result of this work. They decided to, the adults with disabilities decided that the primary thing that they wanted to work on was sidewalk connectedness, particularly around the buildings that they frequented a lot. And so that's where photo voice came in. So we had images of impossible to navigate terrain and like show up to work looking good because you had to walk through mud. And we actually, over a 3-year period, were able to get sidewalk connectivity in the places that we identified. And that was free to us because the city thought it was important. And so that was wonderful. And so we also had some organizational policy change at the Monroe County Library. They wrote down, they made a policy where they need to have a disability section and that it would be updated because what they noticed was all of the information about disability was like from the 1960s and awful, like really painful and hurtful. And so now that's not a thing. They also replaced all the technology because it was inaccessible to people who are blind and low vision. And so they got new equipment so that it could be used by as many people as possible. And they also hired an inclusion director. And so I thought that was really, really amazing. And they were interested in it anyways. You know, it's not just because of this project. And so this slide really illustrates the ecology of the prevention strategy, creating protective environments. We want to create them, and that meant that we needed to impact the infrastructure of the town. So we did that at the community level around this desire to address the environment. So we were able to impact those bus routes by increasing the shelters, the landing pads, because a lot in Bloomington, they lack a place where you can actually stand and not get muddy or rained on. So they increased those, and they also structurally redesigned them because we found that it was too narrow for a power chair to actually get into the ones that where you could like get out of the rain or the cold. And I thought that was really cool. So on those bus routes, we were able to create connectedness on the sidewalks that were identified as crucial by the stakeholders with disabilities. And during the process of participatory mapping, we were able to identify needs within the institutions, like I told you, and that resulted in that complete redesign inside the public library. But the results for individual participants with disabilities was an increase in spontaneity, an increase in fun and community with their friends, because through this 3-year project, we took public transportation because that is what was available to the central stakeholders. And so people learned how to use Double Map, which is an app that shows you where the buses are at any given time and how much money you need and where to wait for them and where you get off. And so what this did was construct a map inside people's heads. And speaking of maps, they learned how to read a map. People are like losing that skill because of GPS. And it's really a nice way to orient yourself. And we increase the independence of individuals by destigmatizing interdependence. At the end of this, all the people, the organizational people, were no longer afraid to interact with people with disabilities. And people with disabilities felt like it was okay to get help and to ask and demand what they need. And I thought that was like, it gives me goosebumps to think about it. And it was beautiful. So I hope that you can see how the prevention approach at each level work as a social ecology. So our prevention practices must be ecological. And so I just want to tell you briefly, ask you to go to our website. It's indisabilityjustice.org, and this is my opus to our movement. This website is phenomenal. We have, I know I'm biased, I'll admit it. We have more than 25 webinars that bring together disability justice and sexual violence primary prevention. Each one was organized by and features disabled people, cross disability. They're phenomenal. Please check it out. We also have 5 forms of accessible evaluation. If what you get in the guide is not enough, we have more. We just completed a community strengths, needs, and desires assessment. We asked people with disabilities in the state of Indiana to tell us about their childhoods, about the support that they did or did not get for things including like self-pleasure and kinks and like all the fun things. We learned a lot from that, and that is also available on our website. We have infographics for you, because one of the main things that I think people in this field are working on, like with people with disabilities, is actually addressing healthy sexuality. And so I believe that those infographics will help you to understand what people with disabilities have experienced, but also what they need and want from sexual relationships. And so it is very beautiful. Let's see, what else do we have? Oh my gosh. Okay, on this website, we pay content creators. Every single human that gave us stuff for this website was paid hundreds of dollars for their contribution. We have over 100 stories and art and creative writing. We have a novel on there. And so people are telling us about their experience of ableism and how that impacts their risk for sexual violence. And they are telling you what they need from you as preventionists, the whole thing. And so I really invite you to check that out.